The house was quiet that night. Too quiet for a week before Christmas. The only sound came from the ticking of the clock above the mantel and the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. I sat at the far end of the dining table, tracing the rim of my empty glass, trying to ignore the weight in my chest. Laura was laughing softly, her nails clicking against her phone screen. Ryan sat beside her, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. They had finished dinner. The kind that looks festive but feels cold. I was still chewing the last bite of turkey when she said it. Everyone agreed it's less stressful without you this year. Mom. She said it like she was announcing the weather. Like it wasn't a sentence that could bruise someone. My first thought was that she was joking. I waited for her to smile or wave it off. But she didn't. She just took a sip of her wine and looked past me. Already on to the next topic. Ryan didn't look up. He pushed peas around his plate. I wanted him to say something. Anything. He didn't. I folded my napkin slowly and set it on the table. I could feel my heart beating hard. But my voice came out calm. Well, that sounds nice for everyone, I said. I hope you have a good trip. Laura smiled politely, as if I'd just given her permission. We'll be at my mom's in Seattle. It's just easier that way. Smaller crowd. Less tension. Less tension. I had lived long enough to know what that meant. I stood up, carried my plate to the sink, and washed it. The water ran hot, burning my hands. Ryan mumbled something about checking the car tires for the drive. Laura followed him, humming. I stayed in the kitchen, staring out the window at the empty yard. The Christmas lights along the fence flickered unevenly. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house wasn't peace. It was the kind that follows being dismissed. I remembered when this place used to echo with Ryan's laughter. The smell of cookies baking. The radio playing Bing Crosby. Now it felt like a museum someone forgot to lock up. I didn't cry. I'd learned that crying only made me feel smaller. Instead, I got up, pulled on my robe, and sat by the window with my laptop. I opened the browser, typed in holiday getaways near Seattle, and scrolled without really looking. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning to exist somewhere I wasn't in the way. The house creaked with the winter wind. From downstairs I could still smell Laura's expensive candles. The kind that claimed to smell like forests, but really smell like money. Flights were expensive so close to Christmas. I found one to Seattle on the 23rd. Early morning. One way, for now. My hands trembled as I entered my credit card number. When the confirmation appeared, it felt less like buying a ticket and more like reclaiming a piece of air I could finally breathe. I closed the laptop and stared at the faint reflection of my face in the glass. 67 years old. Lines where there used to be dimples. Hair thinning near the temples. My mother used to say that old age doesn't make you invisible. People do. Tonight, I understood what she meant. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the table before they came downstairs. I could hear their footsteps above me. Their voices muffled. Their plans being made without my name in them. Ryan came down first, rubbing his eyes. Morning. Mom? Sleep okay? Fine, I said, and handed him a mug. He looked relieved that I wasn't upset. He always hated conflict, even small ones. He started telling me about the drive to Seattle, how they'd stay at Laura's mom's house, how her cousins would be there. I nodded, smiled in the right places. Inside, something in me was already packing its bags. Laura came down, dressed for work, smelling like peppermint lotion. She barely glanced at me. I told her breakfast was ready. She said she wasn't hungry. Before she left, she paused by the door, phone in hand. We'll probably head out on the 22nd, she said. Don't worry about dinner that night. We'll grab something on the road. All right, I said. Have a safe trip. When the door closed behind her, the house fell silent again. I washed the mugs, wiped the counter, and walked through each room. Every detail felt like proof that I no longer belonged. The photo of Ryan's graduation had been moved to the hallway. The old rug from my parents' house was gone. Even the curtains smelled like her perfume. I sat in my old armchair and thought of how strange it is to outlive your place in your own family. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just tired of apologizing for existing. That evening, while they watched television, I made a list in my notebook. One page titled Bills Paid This Month. Another titled What I'll Need. Passport. Prescriptions. Comfortable shoes. Warm coat. It felt almost exciting. Like planning a secret adventure. Later that night, I heard them laughing upstairs. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the urge to join them. I knew where I was not wanted. I went downstairs, opened the window slightly, and breathed in the cold December air. The smell of pine from the neighbor's yard mixed with wood smoke from distant chimneys. Somewhere, far off, someone was playing Christmas music. I whispered to myself, half a prayer, half a promise. If they don't need me for their peace, I'll find mine somewhere else. The next morning, I placed the flight confirmation printout in my purse, next to my wallet. It was thin and ordinary, but it felt like freedom. For the rest of the week, I stayed quiet, polite, invisible. I helped with the laundry, smiled when spoken to, nodded through their plans. Laura must have thought I'd accepted it, that I'd stay behind like a dog too old for travel. On the night of the 21st, after they went to bed, I stood at the kitchen window again. The yard was covered in frost. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. My reflection looked back at me, calm this time, almost peaceful. I whispered one last thing before turning off the light. They'll never notice the silence I leave behind until it's too late. Then I walked upstairs and started packing. The first morning they moved in, I baked muffins. It was early fall of 2021. And the leaves in Portland were just starting to turn that copper color that makes you think life is softening, not ending. Ryan had lost his job at the engineering firm, and Laura said their lease in Beaverton was up. It was supposed to be for 6 months, just until they got back on their feet. I said yes before they even finished asking. The first few weeks were fine. I liked having noise in the house again. The sound of footsteps. The smell of coffee that wasn't mine. Laura helped with dinner sometimes, and she'd bring flowers from the grocery store. We sat at the table like a family. For a little while, I almost believed we were. Then one afternoon she said the living room felt cluttered. Too many old things, she said. Too dark. I looked around and saw what she meant to her eyes. To mine. It was home. The oak cabinet that had belonged to my parents. The porcelain lamps. The framed embroidery I made when Ryan was a baby. She stood in the doorway, hands on hips, scanning it like a showroom manager. It would look so much more open if we changed a few things, she said. A few days later, I came home from the store to find an empty space where the oak cabinet had been. The indentation in the carpet still marked its shape. I asked her what happened, and she smiled. Said she sold it to a local antique buyer for $300. It was just sitting there, collecting dust, she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That cabinet had held my wedding china and my husband's old cufflinks. I ran my hand along the wall where it used to stand, feeling the cold space it left behind. At dinner that night, I told Ryan I missed the cabinet. He said Laura was trying to make the place more comfortable, that I should let her do her thing. He called it nesting. I called it erasing. By winter, half of my things were gone. The old rug from the den was replaced with a sleek gray one, Laura said, was easier to vacuum. She took down the family pictures because, in her words, they didn't match the new aesthetic. I noticed mine didn't appear anywhere new. I didn't fight her. I told myself that arguing would only make things tense for Ryan. He'd always been a peacekeeper, the kind who mistook silence for harmony. So I bit my tongue and watched the house become someone else's. I started spending more time upstairs, reading, or walking the neighborhood. Laura began hosting small dinners. I stayed out of the way. Once, during a party, I came downstairs for water, and she whispered that guests were using the dining room. Maybe I could take a break upstairs until they left. She said it kindly, as if she were offering me rest. That night, I sat on my bed, listening to laughter echo through the floorboards. I used to love that sound. Now it felt like someone else's life happening above me. One afternoon, in early 2022, I went looking for my wedding album. It had been in the linen closet for years. When I opened the door, it was gone. I found it later in a plastic bin in the garage, tucked behind paint cans. The cover was bent from the weight of something heavy on top. I sat on a stool and flipped through the pages. My husband's smile, Ryan's baby face, the dog we used to have. I felt like a trespasser in my own memories. By then, I'd started keeping track of expenses. The groceries, the utilities, the repairs I paid for without being asked. $2,000 here, $400 there. It wasn't about the money. It was about the proof that I still mattered, that I wasn't invisible. When summer came, the tension was something we all pretended not to feel. Laura worked from home and kept the kitchen spotless. As if a crumb could ruin her image, she'd correct me gently when I cooked. Maybe don't use so much salt. Or that pan scratches easily. Ryan tried to joke about it, said she was just particular. But one night, when she criticized the way I folded the laundry, I caught his eyes flick toward me. Embarrassed. He knew she'd gone too far, but he didn't say a word. By Christmas that year, the house was barely recognizable. The curtains were white instead of the floral ones I'd sewn, the furniture rearranged, and my collection of angel figurines packed away in boxes labeled basement. Laura said she'd decluttered to make space for a new bookshelf. I spent most of the holiday pretending not to notice. I cooked a ham, set the table, tried to make it feel festive. Laura thanked me, then announced they'd spend New Year's with her mother. That was the first time I felt something harden inside me. A quiet knowing that this was no longer my home, just a place I paid for. Still, I smiled and wished them a safe drive. I'd learned by then that my peace was something I had to protect quietly. In 2023, Laura started leaving early for work, heels clicking across the hardwood she'd insisted on installing. I'd listen to the car pull out of the driveway before I'd make my own coffee. Those quiet mornings were the only time I felt like the house remembered me. Sometimes, I'd open the closet and look at the empty shelf where the cabinet used to stand. I'd touch the edge of the wall, still faintly darker where the wood had shielded it from the sun. It was silly, but I could almost hear my husband's voice from years ago, laughing as he polished it. The day Laura sold the cabinet was the day I started disappearing, not all at once, but little by little, like light fading at dusk. I knew she didn't hate me. That would have been easier. She just wanted a life that didn't include my kind of history. And Ryan, caught between us, pretended not to see what was being erased. That fall, she threw another dinner party. The house glowed with candles, laughter spilling into the hallway. I stayed upstairs again, reading the same page over and over. When the noise died down, I came downstairs to find crumbs on the floor, empty glasses on the table, and one of my embroidered napkins stained with wine. I cleaned in silence, the smell of her perfume still hanging in the air. I looked around and realized there was almost nothing left of me here. Later that night, I opened my notebook and added up the expenses. The total came to $79,200. 3 years of paying for comfort that was no longer mine. I closed the book and sat for a while, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere, deep inside, something shifted. Not anger yet. Just awareness. The kind that comes before a storm. When I turned off the light, the living room felt foreign. Stripped bare, but pretending to shine. I went upstairs quietly, each step creaking like an old confession. The air smelled of candles and wine, and a faint trace of loss I couldn't name. I didn't know it then. But that night was the last time I'd ever try to belong in that house. Morning came with a hard frost and a sky the color of old pewter. I was in the kitchen rinsing berries when I heard Laura in the dining room. Her voice low and efficient the way it gets when she is negotiating a reservation or a return. She said her name, and then she said my name and the word account in the same breath. I stood very still and listened to the pause that follows when a stranger asks for verification. She offered our address, the last 4 digits of Ryan's phone. Then added that she was helping her mother-in-law with some routine transfers. Her tone was bright. A little laugh on the end of each sentence. The kind of laugh that tries to make a boundary feel silly. I kept my eyes on the sink and counted the seconds. Then she said that yes, 2,500 would be fine, and that she could come by later with a signature if needed. When she hung up, she breezed into the kitchen for a glass of water. She told me she would be late that day and asked whether I needed anything from downtown. I said I did not, and watched a small white ring from her glass bloom on the oak table where the cabinet used to stand. She left, and the house sank back into its careful quiet. I wiped the ring from the table and stood in the middle of the room, trying to decide if I had heard what I thought I had heard. I am not foolish. I know what it is to give someone the benefit of the doubt so many times that it becomes a habit. I told myself to breathe. Then I took my notebook from the drawer and wrote the date. The call from the bank came 2 days later. Mid-morning. When the light in the living room is kind, and everything looks softer than it is. A polite man introduced himself as Raymond Chu from my neighborhood branch. He said there had been a large transfer from the savings account that listed me as the primary holder and asked if I could confirm. I asked him to repeat the amount, and then I sat down because my knees were not as reliable as my pride. He said there had been several transfers in recent months that looked similar, and that one had been initiated that morning. He said the kind of sentence that sounds calm but carries warning inside it. He said he just wanted to be sure I was aware. I thanked him and told him I would come in. Then I hung up and stared at the phone as if it were a new kind of animal. The house seemed to tilt. Just a fraction. The way it does when a bus passes and you are standing too close to the curb. I poured myself water and drank it in small sips until my hands stopped shaking. At the branch, Raymond Chu was younger than I had imagined and kind, in the precise way of someone who has watched the same thing happen to different people many times. He brought me into a small office with glass walls and lowered blinds that did not quite meet in the middle. He pulled up the statements and turned the screen so I could see without having to lean. He pointed to a string of withdrawals. Regular. Neat. Like beads. They were not mine. He asked whether anyone else was authorized on the account. I said that years ago I had added Ryan as a precaution after my husband died. That he almost never used it. That I trusted him. I heard the defensiveness in my voice and disliked it. He nodded and said that sometimes information travels through a house without anyone meaning it to. He asked if I wanted the card replaced and the online access reset. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to flag the most recent transfer for review. I thought of Laura's heels clicking across my floor and the easy way she smiled when she was about to move something that did not belong to her. I said yes to that too. He printed copies of the last year's statements and slid them into a plain folder. He did not hurry me. When I stood to leave, he said that if I needed to talk further, there were elder services that could help, and that most people did not know where to begin. Which was nothing to be ashamed of. I thanked him. On the way out, I passed the holiday display of charity cards, and almost reached for one out of habit, before remembering that I had already given more than enough this year. Outside. The air felt sharp and clean. I sat in my car with the folder in my lap and listened to the sound of my breath. On the first page, the numbers lined up in their little rows. Indifferent. Exact. I ran my finger down the columns, as if touching them could make them less true. Then I closed the folder and placed it on the passenger seat, where my husband used to sit and say that everything would be all right, because he believed that saying it sometimes made it so. I did not tell Laura. I did not tell Ryan. I went home, made tea, and spread the statements on the dining table. I added the totals to the list I had started months ago. The sum looked like a year's salary from the time when work meant a place to be proud of in the morning and tired of in the evening. My hand shook once and then steadied. That night at dinner, Laura chatted about her mother's roast and the cousins who would be flying in. Ryan seemed relieved that I was quiet. He has a special relief that appears when the air in the room is not asking him to choose. I passed the salad and complimented the dressing that she said was from a food blogger she followed. I cleared the dishes, loaded the dishwasher, and reminded myself that silence is not surrender when it is chosen. After they went upstairs, I called Trudy. With her, I never have to perform. I told her what I had heard, what the banker had shown me, how the numbers lined up like small betrayals. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill almost no one has anymore. When she finally spoke, she asked if I wanted a fight or a plan. I said a plan. She said that plans require patience and a good record of facts and a place to go for a weekend when the plan begins. She told me to breathe and to do nothing tonight. She said that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is let people believe she is weaker than she is and then step aside while the truth reveals them. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. The house sounded different when I imagined myself as its guest. I thought of the cabinet, the rug, the album, the way every absence had been explained as efficiency. It is a strange relief to realize that the story you have been telling yourself is not the one that has been playing out in front of you. The next day, I walked to the bank again because moving my body is how I keep from turning into fog. I signed the forms to reset the access. I chose a new password that no one would guess because no one knew my father's middle name and the street he grew up on and the year he taught me to ride a bike in the parking lot of a church that is now a coffee shop. Raymond printed a temporary card and handed it to me with that careful tone he uses when something is fragile that does not want to be called fragile. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home and bought flour and oranges and a small bouquet of winter greens. I arranged them in a jar on the kitchen counter and felt a small surge of defiance that surprised me with its warmth. Laura walked in while I was zesting the oranges and said the kitchen smelled nice. She told me she would be working late and that Ryan would heat leftovers. I said all right. She did not notice the folder on the top shelf of the pantry between the flour and the pasta. I had labeled it recipes. That evening, I took my notebook to the armchair and wrote out a timeline. The first day they moved in, the party where I stayed upstairs, the missing cabinet, the call to the bank, the meeting with Raymond, the resets. I left space between each entry for details I might remember later. I printed a second copy of the statements and tucked them inside the notebook. Then I placed both inside a tote bag and set it behind the chair. If someone decided to declutter the tote bag, that would be a different kind of story. Ryan came down and asked if I wanted to watch a show. He looked tired and young in the particular way that men look young when they do not know who they are supposed to be loyal to. I said maybe tomorrow. He said Laura had a big week and that she was under a lot of stress. I said I understood. He seemed grateful for my understanding, as if it were something he could deposit and withdraw as needed. When he went to bed, I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table. It is a sturdy thing, scarred with the faint lines of the years. The place where birthdays were sung and homework was argued, and my husband smoothed the newspaper before handing it to me. Laura wants a newer one, smoother and lighter. In my mind, I pictured it leaving on a truck and felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when you know the difference between what can be taken and what cannot. I slept well that night, better than I had in months. In the morning, I woke before the sun and made coffee. I watched the darkness at the window lift into a soft gray. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard settled. I thought about what Trudy had said. I thought about the patience required to let a plan ripen. I thought about the way a door feels when you close it behind you because you decided to, not because someone told you to. Before the others came down, I took a plain sheet of paper and wrote 3 words in small letters at the top. Keep the proof. Then I put the paper in the front of the folder and closed it. The sound was quiet and final in a way that satisfied me. I put the kettle on and took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for anyone to invite me to my own life. A soft rain began that afternoon, the kind that barely touches the ground before disappearing. I made a pot of tea and sat by the window, listening to it tap against the glass. The world outside looked washed clean. But inside the house, everything still carried that invisible heaviness. I thought about what Trudy had said, that patience and proof were the start of any plan worth keeping. When the phone rang, I almost ignored it. Then I saw her name flash across the screen. Trudy never called twice in one day unless it mattered. I answered. And before I could say hello, she said she had someone I needed to meet. His name is Daniel Bishop, she said. He used to be a lawyer. Retired now. Helped a few women in his church sort through property issues. He's kind, discreet, and he'll tell you exactly what's possible without sugarcoating it. I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone besides her about the money. The idea of talking to a lawyer, even a retired one, made me feel exposed, as if I was admitting that my own family couldn't be trusted. Trudy must have heard the silence, because she said softly, "You don't have to decide today. Just meet him. He's Emily's father. You remember her from the hospital fundraisers years ago." I did remember. Emily Bishop, now director of the Silver Horizon Foundation, had sent me newsletters in the past. One of them was sitting in a pile of mail near the front door, unopened. "All right," I said finally. "I'll meet him." The next morning, I drove to Trudy's house, the one with the blue shutters and the wind chime that never stopped moving. Daniel was already there. He stood when I walked in, tall and dignified, a little gray at the temples but steady in his movements. He shook my hand as if it still meant something to meet someone properly. Trudy made coffee and left us at the kitchen table. "Trudy tells me you've had some trouble," he said. I smiled. The polite kind. The one that buys time. "Trouble feels like too small a word," I said. He nodded, then opened a small notebook. He didn't write anything yet. He just waited. So I told him. Not everything. Not yet. Just enough for him to understand that my son and his wife had been living with me. That the money in the account had moved without my knowledge. That I wasn't ready to accuse anyone. But I wanted to know what I could do to protect myself. He listened like someone who actually planned to use what he heard. When I finished, he said that Oregon law considered financial exploitation of elders a serious matter, even within families. He said my silence was understandable but not required. Then he asked the question that sat in my chest long after the coffee went cold. "Do you want to get even or get free?" I looked out the window where the rain had stopped and the world seemed to be holding its breath. I said, "I want to stop feeling small in my own house." He nodded again. Wrote something. then tore the page out and slid it toward me. It was a list of things to gather statements. Bills. Any receipts I had for items sold or missing. At the bottom, he'd written one more thing in neat cursive. Find a safe place to stay for a few days. When I looked up, he was watching me carefully. You don't have to tell them you're leaving, he said. Just go. People show their true selves when they think you're not coming back. I folded the paper and tucked it into my purse. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought a bag of coffee beans and a small bottle of wine. They were for me. A quiet reward for doing something brave. That night, I sat at the table, pretending to read while Laura packed gift bags for her coworkers. Ryan came in, kissed her cheek, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I said I was tired. He smiled like he was relieved. Later, when the house was still, I opened my laptop and looked at flights. Seattle was close. Just a few hours by car. But I wanted distance that couldn't be reached by accident. I typed in departure cities, then stopped at the word Seattle. A memory surfaced of a letter from Emily Bishop inviting me to a winter gala at the Paramount Grand Hotel, celebrating volunteers and educators. It was still in that same pile of mail near the door. I found the letter, smoothed the crease, and read it again. The date was December 24. I checked the calendar. 2 weeks away. Something about the timing made me laugh quietly. Maybe life was giving me a way out disguised as an invitation. The next day, I called Emily. She remembered me immediately. Said she'd love for me to attend and that the foundation would cover accommodations for honored guests. I hesitated before accepting. But she said, it would mean a lot to have you there. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen staring at the little note Daniel had written. A safe place to stay. I smiled. I had just found one. That evening, while Laura and Ryan argued softly upstairs about luggage and gifts, I started a list in my notebook. It wasn't just what to pack. It was what to leave behind. When Ryan came downstairs, I asked about their Christmas plans. He said they'd be leaving for Seattle on the 22nd to stay with her family. Perfect. I thought. I'd be gone before them. Invisible once more. But by choice this time. The following morning, I called the airline and booked a ticket for December 23. Early flight. One way. I paid for it myself and printed the confirmation. I didn't even flinch at the cost. It felt like buying back my dignity. That night, I slipped the confirmation printout into my purse with the folder labeled recipes. The paper made a small sound when it settled. A whisper of intent. 2 days later, I met Daniel again. I gave him the folder, the notebook, and the receipts. He said he would hold on to them until after the holidays. That he'd help me open a trust account and start the process quietly. He didn't call it revenge. He called it preparation. Before I left, he looked at me and said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace." Driving home through the December fog, I felt a strange calm. I turned on the radio and listened to carols that used to make me cry. They didn't this time. That night, I sat in bed, writing a short note in careful cursive. I'm going to take a little trip to rest. Don't worry about me. I left it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. Outside, the yard shimmered with frost. I packed my suitcase, one layer at a time. A wool coat, my good shoes, the pearl earrings Ryan gave me years ago. I added my husband's watch last, slipped it into the inside pocket, and zipped the bag shut. By the time the sun rose, the house was quiet again. I brewed a pot of coffee, poured it into my travel mug, and stood at the window one last time. The reflection that stared back wasn't the same woman who had stayed silent for 3 years. She looked steady, even a little defiant. When I walked out the door, the air was sharp and cold. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into it. The porch light was still on behind me, flickering like a small apology. I didn't look back. The city smelled like winter and coffee when I stepped out of the taxi in front of the Paramount Grand Hotel. The air was colder than I expected. The kind that makes your breath visible and your hands ache no matter how deep they're tucked into your coat pockets. The driver helped with my suitcase. And when he wished me a Merry Christmas, I realized it was the first time in years someone had said those words to me without obligation. Inside, the lobby shimmered with gold lights and polished marble. There was a tall tree near the staircase, every branch covered in glass ornaments that caught the light and sent it scattering across the floor. I stood there for a moment, just taking it in. No one knew me here. And for the first time, that felt like freedom instead of loneliness. The woman at the front desk checked me in quickly, her smile warm and unhurried. She handed me a key card and told me my room had a view of the city. I thanked her and took the elevator to the 8th floor. When the doors opened, the scent of cedar and cinnamon greeted me. My room was small but beautiful. A window that looked out over Seattle's rooftops and the harbor beyond. I unpacked slowly, placing my coat in the closet, setting my husband's old watch on the nightstand. The quiet was soft, not the suffocating kind that filled my house. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the day Laura told me to stay home. The gala was that evening. I laid out the navy dress I hadn't worn since Ryan's wedding. It still fit, though my reflection in the mirror showed a different woman now. Someone older. Yes, but stronger too. I pinned my hair up, put on lipstick, and slipped the pearl earrings through my ears. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize myself. The ballroom downstairs was already buzzing when I arrived. Soft music played, the kind of jazz that lives in hotel lobbies. I spotted Emily Bishop across the room and waved. She looked radiant in silver and greeted me with genuine warmth. "You made it," she said, hugging me lightly. "I'm so glad you came." I was surprised how natural it felt to be there. The tables were covered in white cloth, candles flickering, people laughing easily. For the first time in years, I was part of something again, not an extra piece that didn't fit. Then Daniel appeared. He was dressed in a dark suit, hair neatly combed, his expression calm and kind as ever. I hadn't expected him to be there, though of course I should have guessed. He smiled when he saw me. "I see you followed my advice," he said. I told him I'd only taken half of it. I still had to learn the rest. He laughed softly and offered me his arm. "Shall we find our seats?" Then, we sat together near the center of the room. The meal was elegant but simple, and the conversation flowed around us like music. He told me about the people he'd helped after retirement, how most of them just needed someone to listen. I listened to him in return, and the sound of his voice made me feel steady, grounded. At some point, I realized the photographer had been circling the room, snapping pictures of guests. When he reached our table, Daniel leaned slightly toward me and smiled for the camera. I smiled too. A real smile. The kind I hadn't felt in years. The flash caught the glint of the pearls at my ears and Daniel's hand resting casually on the table beside mine. After dinner, Emily went to the stage and began the presentation. She spoke about the Foundation's work, about dignity and independence and the power of women supporting one another. Then she called my name. For a second, I thought she'd made a mistake, but she looked straight at me, smiling. "Margaret Hale," she said, "a lifelong educator, volunteer, and advocate for seniors in our community. Tonight, we honor her for her dedication and heart." The applause rose like a wave. I stood, shaky at first, but the sound wrapped around me, warm and steady. When I walked to the stage, I saw Daniel standing too, clapping quietly, his eyes soft. Emily handed me a small crystal plaque and whispered, "You deserve this." When I looked out over the crowd, something in me shifted. I had spent years being quiet so others could feel comfortable, shrinking so no one would feel small beside me. Standing there, I realized that silence had never protected me. It had only made me disappear. After the ceremony, people came up to congratulate me. Strangers told me stories about teachers who had changed their lives. I smiled, thanked them, accepted a glass of champagne I didn't even drink. The photographer asked for one more photo, and I said yes. Daniel stood beside me again, his presence calm. I nasaming. The lights flashed, and in that instant I felt like myself again, fully visible. Later, I slipped outside onto the terrace. The city stretched out below, lights glittering like constellations. The air was cold, sharp against my skin. I leaned on the railing and watched snow begin to fall, tiny flakes drifting through the night. Daniel joined me after a while. For someone who had helped so many people, he spoke very little about himself. We stood in silence for a few minutes before he said quietly, "You know, sometimes the best revenge is peace." I smiled. I'm starting to believe that. When I returned to my room, my phone was vibrating on the nightstand. 10 missed calls. Laura's name lit up the screen over and over again. I didn't answer. I scrolled through the notifications until one caught my eye. A post from the Silver Horizon Foundation had tagged me in a photo honoring Margaret Hale, retired educator and community volunteer, for her lifelong commitment to kindness and resilience. The picture showed me and Daniel, both smiling, the ballroom glowing behind us. Dozens of people had commented, congratulating, liking, sharing. I stared at it for a long time. It was a simple photo, but I knew how it would look to someone who wanted to twist it. The phone buzzed again. I turned it face down. I took off my earrings, placed them carefully on the dresser, and sat on the bed. For the first time in a long time, I felt no guilt in being content. The sound of the city outside was like distant music, somewhere across town. Maybe Laura had seen the photo. Maybe she was pacing, calling Ryan, demanding explanations for things that didn't need any. Maybe she was furious that I could be smiling without her permission. I turned off the light and lay back on the bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and clean linen. As I closed my eyes, I thought about the words Daniel had said, about peace, about the quiet strength of it. I wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The morning light crept through the hotel curtains, soft and golden, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it really is. I woke to the hum of the city below and the faint ache in my chest that always followed a night of unexpected happiness. For a few minutes, I let myself stay still, letting the quiet remind me that I was far from home and, for now, free. When I finally picked up my phone, there were more messages than I could count. Laura's name filled the screen, one missed call after another, each one stamped with the same frantic energy. Then there were texts from Ryan, short and polite, the kind of messages that try to hide tension behind courtesy. "Are you okay? Mom, and please call when you can." I stared at the words, then set the phone back down. The sound of my heartbeat was louder than the city noise. I poured a cup of hotel coffee and stood by the window, watching the people below hurry through the cold, their breath visible in the air. I wondered how long it would take before Laura turned her worry into anger. I didn't have to wonder long. By the time I checked out and reached the train station, a new voicemail waited for me. I listened with my thumb hovering over the delete button. Laura's voice filled the speaker, sharp and shaking. She said she'd seen the photo online, that I'd embarrassed the family, that people were asking questions. I could hear the clinking of glass behind her. Maybe a wine glass. Maybe something thrown. She ended the message with the same brittle laugh she used when she wanted control back. You really outdid yourself this time, Margaret. I deleted the message and boarded my train home. The ride back to Portland felt shorter than it should have. I watched the scenery blur by. Mountains fading into gray sky. Water dark and restless. My reflection in the train window looked older, but there was something steadier in it too. I had no idea what waited for me at home, but I knew I would not walk into it as the same woman who left. When I unlocked the front door, the house was empty. The faint smell of Laura's perfume still hung in the air, sweet and artificial. I set down my suitcase and took a deep breath. The silence was heavy but no longer cruel. On the counter sat an envelope addressed to me in Laura's neat handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. We need to talk. I don't appreciate being made a fool of. Call me. I folded it and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, staring at the grain in the wood. My hands didn't shake this time. That evening, I called Daniel. When he answered, his voice carried that same quiet steadiness I'd come to rely on. I told him about the calls, the photo, the tone in Laura's voice. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "They're reacting to losing control. That's all this is. Don't let them pull you back into their storm." I said I wasn't sure what to do next. He said he had already started gathering information about my accounts and property records. Then he asked if he could connect me with someone he knew from the community legal office, someone who specialized in elder financial protection. I hesitated. It still felt strange hearing that word, elder, attached to me, but I said yes. A few days later, I met Daniel at a small office downtown. The woman he introduced me to, Pastor Helen, wore a simple gray sweater and had a calm, clear gaze. She worked part-time with a local church and volunteered as a community advocate. When she spoke, her voice carried both warmth and certainty, like someone who had seen too many wrong things and refused to accept them quietly. She asked me questions gently. About the bank account, about the house, about whether I had ever signed anything I didn't understand. I showed her the copies of the bank statements and the notes I'd written. She looked through them carefully, nodding. "This is more common than you'd think," she said. "Families can get complicated when money and pride mix together. But you're doing the right thing by getting ahead of it." Daniel mentioned that he'd already found irregularities in one of the property tax documents. It looked as if someone had attempted to access the account online using my credentials. He told me not to worry, that he had already filed a hold request through his contacts at the county office. It was a strange feeling, sitting there between them, realizing that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. When I got home, I made tea and sat by the window again. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised snow. I thought about Laura's message, her anger disguised as concern. I wondered if she understood what she had set in motion. That night, another call came. This time I answered. Laura's voice was tight. "You could have told me you were leaving. People saw that photo. Mom, you're with some man at a fancy event. And now everyone's asking questions. What were you thinking?" I kept my tone even. I was thinking I deserved to spend Christmas with people who valued me. There was a long silence on her end. Then she said, "Get her. You've really changed. Haven't you?" I didn't respond. She hung up first. For the next few days, The house stayed still. Ryan didn't call. Laura didn't show up. It was just me. The hum of the refrigerator. And the faint ticking of the clock. I felt both the loneliness and the relief of it. On the fourth morning, I walked to the church where Pastor Helen worked. The sanctuary was empty except for a few candles flickering near the front. She was there, sorting donations, and smiled when she saw me. "You came," she said. I told her I didn't want to sit at home waiting for something to happen. I wanted to be useful. She handed me a stack of envelopes. "You can help me with these," she said. "Letters to seniors who might need a reminder they're not forgotten." As I wrote, my hand steadied. Each name felt like a small thread connecting me back to something real. When I got home that afternoon, a new message blinked on the answering machine. It was Daniel again. His voice was calm but firm. "I've been looking into Laura's financial activity. There's a pattern you'll want to see. I think it's time we meet again." I called him back that evening. We agreed to meet the next morning at his office. Before bed, I opened the envelope Laura had left on the counter. I read the note again. Slower this time. The words didn't sting anymore. They just looked small. I put the paper in the folder with the bank statements and zipped it shut. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the flakes drift through the light. The street was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for forgiveness. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly through the night. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and whispered to the reflection looking back at me. "This time, they'll hear me." Then I turned off the light. The snow from the night before had frozen into a thin crust that cracked beneath my boots as I walked to the car. The cold air burned my throat. But I felt awake in a way I hadn't for years. The sky was pale and empty, and the quiet of the morning felt like a clean page waiting to be written on. Daniel's office sat on the edge of downtown, tucked between a coffee shop and a used bookstore that smelled of dust and old paper. When I arrived, he was already there, standing by the window with a cup of tea in his hand. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that makes you feel steady even before you sit down. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. He nodded, not surprised. Then he opened a folder and turned it toward me. Inside were several printed statements, each highlighted in neat yellow lines. "These are from your joint accounts," he said. "I found a pattern of transfers that go back further than we thought. The amounts aren't huge at first, but they grow. It looks like Laura has been moving money quietly for almost a year." I stared at the paper, the numbers swimming for a moment before settling into focus. "Did Ryan know?" "I don't think so," Daniel said gently. "But it's time he does." I didn't answer. The idea of confronting my son made my stomach tighten. I had raised him to be kind. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned to confuse kindness with avoidance. Daniel handed me another document. "I've drafted an affidavit in case you decide to file a report. For now, this just protects your assets. Nothing public." I took it and folded it carefully, as if holding something fragile. "What happens next?" "That depends on how honest they're willing to be," he said. I left the office with a strange calm, the kind that comes when the truth finally starts to take shape. At home, the house felt colder than usual. Ryan's car was in the driveway. I heard voices from the kitchen, Laura's sharp tone cutting through the air. When I walked in, she stopped mid-sentence. "Mom," Ryan said, standing quickly. "We were just talking about you." Laura crossed her arms. "About that photo. Actually, people are calling me asking questions. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" I set my purse on the table. It looks like I had a lovely evening. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy. Mom. She didn't mean it like that. She's just. I know exactly what she meant, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You don't need to explain. Laura's eyes narrowed. You've changed, she said again, just like she had over the phone. You're being dramatic. I looked at her. Really looked. The woman who had spent years trying to control every room she entered suddenly looked small in her own kitchen. Maybe, I said, or maybe I finally stopped pretending this was my home. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Ryan's hand twitched as if he wanted to reach for me. But he didn't. Before either of them could speak, I turned and walked upstairs. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, breathing slowly until my heart settled. On the dresser, the folder from Daniel sat waiting. I opened it again, tracing the lines of my signature, the proof that I was taking back what was mine. The next morning, Ryan called while I was in the garden, clearing the last of the frostbitten plants. His voice sounded softer, smaller. Mom, can we talk? About what I asked. Wiping my hands on my coat. About everything, he said. About what's happening. We met at a diner near his old high school. The waitress recognized me, called me sweetheart, and poured me coffee without asking. I used to bring Ryan there after his baseball games. He used to order pancakes no matter what time it was. He looked tired. I don't know what's true anymore, he said quietly. I stirred my coffee. Then it's time to find out. He ran a hand through his hair. Laura said you're making things up. That you've been talking to people, trying to make her look bad. I looked at him steadily. Does that sound like me? He didn't answer. I reached into my bag and handed him one of the statements Daniel had printed. I'm not trying to make anyone look bad. I'm trying to protect myself. He read it, his face changing slowly. Confusion giving way to understanding. Then shame. She told me these were transfers for bills, he whispered. I nodded. I believe she told you that. He set the paper down and rubbed his eyes. Mom, I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix it, I said softly. You just have to stop pretending it's not broken. When I left the diner, the air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. I walked to my car feeling lighter, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because the truth had finally landed where it belonged. That evening, as the light faded, Pastor Helen knocked on my door. She was holding a thermos and 2 mugs. Thought you could use some company, she said. We sat in the living room, the one that had once been mine, and then theirs, and now, finally, mine again. She poured tea and said she'd spoken to a friend who worked in the county's elder services office. They'll take your statement if you're ready, she said. I hesitated. I don't want to see anyone punished. I just want peace. Peace doesn't come from silence, she said gently. It comes from honesty. I nodded slowly. The truth of her words settled deep. As she stood to leave, she handed me a small recorder. Keep this by your phone, she said. If she calls again, just press the button. Sometimes people tell on themselves without realizing. That night, I placed the recorder beside the phone on the table. It looked ordinary, almost out of place in the neat kitchen. I made tea, turned off the lights, and went upstairs. Sometime after midnight, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice filled the room. Angry, impatient. You think you can take what's mine, you won't last long without us. That house will be ours one way or another. I pressed the record button halfway through her message. My hands didn't shake this time. When the call ended, I sat there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the snow had started again. Soft and relentless. I picked up the recorder, pressed play, and listened to her words echo back to me. It didn't hurt. It didn't even surprise me. It just confirmed what I already knew. I turned off the recorder, placed it in the folder, and closed it with a quiet click. The sound was steady. Final. For the first time, I felt ready for whatever came next. The morning of the meeting arrived clear and cold. The kind of winter morning that looks harmless until the wind cuts through your coat. I stood outside Daniel's office, watching the breath drift from my mouth, trying to steady the rhythm of my hands. Inside, through the frosted glass door, I could see movement. Ryan was already there. Laura, too. I took one last breath, turned the knob, and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Daniel greeted me with a nod, his expression calm but alert. Ryan stood near the window, his arms crossed, looking smaller than I remembered. Laura was seated at the table, her posture straight and tight, her phone face down in front of her like a weapon she might reach for. I sat across from her. No one spoke for a moment. Daniel broke the silence. "Thank you all for coming," he said evenly. "This won't take long if we can all stay respectful." Laura forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, but her fingers tapped against the table. Daniel opened a folder and spread the papers in front of him. "Margaret has raised concerns about financial irregularities related to her accounts and property," he began. "I've reviewed the documents with her. Some transactions were made using her credentials. We'd like to clarify who authorized them." Laura let out a short, brittle laugh. "So this is what this is about. My God. You really think I'd steal from you?" I didn't look at her. "I think you stopped asking before you took," I said quietly. Ryan looked at me then, and for the first time in a long time, I saw him really see me. "Laura," he said slowly, "you told me those transfers were for bills." "They were," she snapped. "Mostly, she offered to help us." Daniel slid one of the papers toward her. "The amounts total more than $70,000 over 3 years," he said. "That's more than help. That's a pattern." She went pale, but her chin stayed high. "You can't prove anything." Daniel pressed a small button on a recorder. Laura's voice filled the room, sharp and unmistakable. "You think you can take what's mine? You won't last long without us. That house will be ours one way or another." The silence that followed was absolute. Ryan's eyes widened, his face crumpling as the realization landed. Laura's hand shot out toward the recorder, but Daniel moved it out of reach. "That's quite enough," he said evenly. "We're not here to humiliate anyone. But the facts are clear. The property and assets in question belong solely to Margaret Hale, effective immediately. All financial ties between you and her are terminated. I've prepared the documentation." He turned to me, sliding a thick packet across the table. "This establishes an irrevocable trust. It transfers ownership of your home and savings into the trust. You remain the sole beneficiary, but control passes to a fiduciary who acts in your interest. Ryan can reside on the property if you choose, but only as a tenant under written agreement." Ryan looked at me, speechless. "Mom," he whispered, "you don't have to do this." "Yes," I said softly, "I do." Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "You're letting this man manipulate you. We've taken care of you for years, and this is how you repay us." I met her gaze. "You lived in my home, spent my money, and sold my memories. That's not care. That's convenience. For a moment, I thought she might say something cruel, something that would hang in the air forever. But instead, she turned to Ryan. Are you really going to let her do this? He didn't look at her. I think she already did, he said quietly. Daniel gathered the papers. The sound crisp and final. He handed me a pen. When you're ready, he said. My hand didn't shake as I signed my name. Each stroke felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself that had been missing for years. When I finished, Daniel notarized the document and closed the folder. It's done, he said simply. Laura's voice broke the silence, low and venomous. You'll regret this. Margaret, don't think you've won. I stood. I'm not trying to win. I'm just done losing. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Ryan stayed seated, staring at his hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he looked up, eyes shining. I didn't know, he said. I swear I didn't know. I placed a hand on his arm. I believe you, I said, but now you do. What you do next is up to you. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening as he tried to speak. I'm so sorry. Mom. I know, I said. Now make sure you never have to say it again. When he left, Daniel and I stood in the quiet office, the air heavy with the echoes of everything that had been said. Outside, a thin light stretched across the skyline, touching the tops of the buildings with a faint gold. Daniel poured me a glass of water. How do you feel? He asked. I thought about it. The word that came to mind surprised me. Lighter, I said. He smiled faintly. Good. That means it's real. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face. Sharp but clean. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft chatter of people heading to lunch. I walked slowly to my car, feeling the weight of years begin to lift from my shoulders. At a stoplight, I looked in the mirror. My reflection was tired, but the eyes staring back at me were steady. The kind of steady that doesn't come from winning, but from surviving. When I got home, I hung my coat by the door and sat at the table. The late afternoon sun reached through the window, landing on the empty space where the oak cabinet used to stand. I smiled, not with sadness this time, but with a strange sense of peace. The things I had lost no longer defined me. The things I had reclaimed could not be taken again. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt like waiting, like the moment right before the first note of a song. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, I didn't dread finding out. Outside, the sky was turning the color of pale copper, and the first stars began to appear. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint hum of the furnace, the rhythm of my own breathing, and the silence that finally belonged to me. The following weeks moved quietly, like snow melting in slow motion. The days lengthened, and the light through the windows shifted from sharp winter white to something warmer, more forgiving. I began to find a rhythm again, small and steady. Mornings started with coffee and a walk around the block. I said hello to neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them had heard pieces of what happened, though none asked directly. They only smiled longer than usual, the way people do when they want you to know they're on your side. Ryan called once a week. His voice sounded different, softer, stripped of the nervous politeness he used to wear like armor. He had moved into a small apartment near the river. It wasn't much, he said, but it was his. He had started therapy, something I never expected him to do, and he said it helped him untangle things he didn't know were knotted. I told him I was proud of him. He cried quietly, thinking I couldn't hear. Laura did not call. I didn't expect her to. I heard from Trudy that she had lost her position at the marketing firm after word of her financial mismanagement spread quietly through town. I knew Daniel hadn't said anything. Some truths have a way of traveling on their own. In late spring, Daniel stopped by with documents for me to sign, finalizing the transfer of my accounts into the trust. He brought fresh bread from a local bakery and insisted I try it while it was still warm. We sat on the porch while the sun dipped low and the air smelled faintly of lilacs. "How does it feel?" he asked, sipping his tea. "Strange," I said. "Free, but strange. Like learning how to walk again after you've been sitting for too long." He smiled. "Freedom always feels awkward at first." I looked out toward the street, where the maple trees were heavy with green leaves. I didn't realize how much of my life had become about keeping the peace, I said, and how little peace there actually was. He nodded. "That's the quiet trap, isn't it? You keep giving pieces of yourself away to keep things calm. And then one day, you realize there's nothing left to give." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the neighborhood settling into evening. I was grateful for his company, but also for the quiet between us. Not the kind that hides tension, but the kind that lets you breathe. By summer, I had joined the Silver Horizon Foundation as a volunteer. I helped organize workshops teaching older women how to protect their finances and recognize manipulation. The first time I stood in front of the group, my hands trembled slightly. Then I told them my story. Not all the details, just enough for them to see that I understood. When I finished, the room was still. Then one woman near the back whispered, "Thank you." I carried that word home with me like a small flame. Life became simple again. I planted tomatoes in the garden, started baking on Sundays, even took a watercolor class at the community center. I wasn't trying to fill the silence anymore. I was learning to live inside it. One afternoon, in early September, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Laura was standing there. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore no makeup. The sharpness I remembered was gone from her face. She looked tired, smaller, somehow, as if the world had worn her down to the truth of herself. I didn't speak first. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes bright with something close to fear. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside and motioned toward the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The same couch, she once said, didn't match her style. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it." I stayed standing, arms crossed loosely. "Why now?" She looked down at her hands. "Because everything fell apart. And for the first time, I couldn't blame anyone else. I thought if I controlled everything, I'd be safe. I didn't realize how much I was destroying in the process." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a second I saw the girl she must have been before life made her hard. I took a seat across from her. "You hurt me," I said, not cruelly, just plainly. "You made me feel like I didn't matter in my own home." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know. And I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just didn't want you to think I walked away without regret." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the room. I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. The pain had settled into something else. Something quieter. "You're right," I said. "Saying sorry doesn't fix it, but it's a start." She looked up, surprised. "You mean you can forgive me?" I shook my head gently. "Forgiveness is not something I give. It's something I grow into. And I'm still growing." She nodded, stood, and wiped her face. "Thank you for letting me say what I needed to." I walked her to the door. She paused on the porch. looking out at the garden. "It's beautiful," she said. "You look happy here." "I am," I said. After she left, I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the crickets start their evening song. I thought about what it meant to forgive. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't pretending it never happened. It was choosing to stop carrying the weight of it. As the sky deepened into dusk, Ryan called. His voice was lighter than I'd heard in years. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to tell you something. I'm starting a new job next week. It's not big, but it's honest work. And I've been seeing someone. She's kind. She reminds me a little of you." I smiled. "That sounds wonderful," I said. He hesitated. Are you really doing okay?" I looked around at the garden. The warm light spilling through the kitchen window. The quiet house that finally felt alive again. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "I really am." After we hung up, I stayed outside until the first stars appeared. The world around me felt steady, grounded. The house no longer echoed with loss. It breathed again. Later, before going to bed, I passed the mirror in the hallway. My reflection caught in the dim light. Lines and silver hair and soft edges that told the story of a woman who had survived herself. I stopped, smiled faintly, and whispered to my reflection, "You did it." The wind rustled the curtains slightly, carrying the faint smell of lilacs from the yard. I turned off the lights and went to bed. The night quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like peace. Winter returned with a soft quiet that felt like a promise instead of a warning. A year had slipped by, measured in small changes that added up to a different life. The house had learned my footsteps again. The garden had grown fuller. The rooms had settled into a kind of calm that did not beg for approval. I woke to the smell of coffee and the glow of a sky just beginning to open. It was the day of the Silver Horizon Gala, and I felt ready in a way I could not have imagined the year before. I dressed slowly, not to look younger, not to impress anyone, but to honor the woman who had stayed when so much else had gone. A deep green dress that fit without apology. The pearl earrings that used to feel too much for an ordinary day. My husband's watch on my wrist, not as a relic of grief, but as a small circle of gratitude. In the mirror, I saw the lines that had arrived and the light that had returned. I nodded once, as if to an old friend. The night air in downtown Portland tasted like cold citrus. I stepped into the Paramount Grand and felt that familiar lift in my chest. The lobby glowed with warm lights and evergreen garlands. A piano murmured something gentle near the bar. Emily met me near the tall tree and pressed my hands with both of hers. She looked happy in that way that comes from seeing someone find their way home to themselves. She told me there was a seat for me near the front. She told me I would speak after the awards. If I still wanted to. I said I did. Daniel appeared as if the evening had been waiting for him to arrive. He wore a navy suit and the easy calm that had steadied me more times than I could count. He took my coat and said that the color suited me. I said that peace suited him. We laughed at the simple truth of it and walked into the ballroom together. The room was full, but not crowded. Trudy waved from a table near the stage and tapped the chair beside her. She looked like every good memory I had of her. Strong and kind and ready with a truth if I asked for one. Ryan was there too, standing a little apart from the others, talking to a woman with warm eyes and an architect's quiet attention to the world. When he saw me, he lifted a hand, then came over and hugged me without words. He smelled like soap and winter air. He said he had saved me a dance. I told him I might let him lead once. Dinner was simple and perfect. Bread that cracked softly. Soup that tasted like comfort. Conversations that did not require armor. The photographer moved through the tables again, and I did not shrink from the lens. The fear of being seen had cooled into something easier. If someone found fault with my joy, they could carry that weight themselves. I had set mine down. When the lights dimmed and the first award was announced, I felt a hum under my ribs. Not nerves exactly. More like a steady drum that kept time with the room. One by one, names were called. Hands were shaken. Applause rose and softened. Emily spoke about the work done that year, about small victories with large echoes. Then she looked toward our table and asked me to join her on the stage. I walked up slowly, letting each step be its own sentence. The hall was a warm sea of faces. At the edge of the stage, I paused and took in the sight of them. The friends and strangers who had gathered to say that care matters, that dignity matters, that truth can be quiet and still carry far. I spoke the way I had learned to live, without rush, without grand gestures, with the exact words I needed and no more. I told them that a year ago I had felt like furniture in my own home. I told them that silence can masquerade as kindness until you realize you have disappeared. I told them that the first time I chose a boundary, my hands shook, and the second time they trembled less. And by the third time I could lift my head and see the horizon again. I thanked the women who had sat in rooms like this long before me. I thanked the men who stood beside them without fear of their light. I thanked the people in the room who had turned their pain into a map for someone else. When I finished, the applause rose like heat. I let it wash over me and then pass through. Afterward, people came to speak to me, not as a symbol, but as a person. A woman in her 70s said she had moved back into the house that had always been hers, and that the first night she slept there alone, she had left the hallway light on for herself. A man about my age said he had apologized to his daughter that morning for not listening sooner. A young volunteer said he wanted to call his grandmother when the gala ended. I held their hands and felt a river of ordinary courage running through the room. Ryan introduced me to the woman he had been talking with. Her name was Sarah. She asked about the garden and the old maple and the best place to buy tomato starts in spring. She did not perform goodness. She merely wore it. I watched my son look at her with respect and ease, and I felt something give in my chest. Not pain, just the release of an old fear I no longer had to carry. Later, music pulled people to the edge of the room. Ryan kept his promise and asked for a slow dance. We moved carefully, the way you do when you love someone enough to be gentle. He said quietly that therapy was teaching him how to speak without apologizing for existing. He said he was learning that being a man did not mean never saying I was wrong. I told him that I was learning to accept joy without asking permission. When the song ended, Daniel offered his hand and we circled the floor once, then stood at the edge of the terrace with our coats draped over our arms. The city lay below like a dark lake scattered with light. He said I looked lighter. I said freedom fits better than anger. He nodded and said that joy is not a betrayal of the past. It is how we keep faith with it. We ended the night the way good nights end, without ceremony. Trudy hugged me and told me my voice had found its home again. Ryan kissed my cheek and whispered that he was proud of me. Sarah said she would like to come by for coffee and to see the garden in the morning light. Emily pressed a folded program into my hand where she had written a single sentence: "Keep choosing yourself." I tucked it into my purse with my husband's watch and the bit of breath I had saved for the walk out into the cold. The drive home was quiet. The roads gleamed under streetlights. The house welcomed me in the way only a house that has been reclaimed can do. I hung my dress carefully, set the pearls in their small dish, and walked barefoot to the kitchen for water. The clock on the stove blinked a soft green. The furnace murmured. Somewhere outside, a wind chime answered a breeze I could not feel. In the hallway, I stopped by the small table I had placed where the old oak cabinet used to stand. On it sat a framed photo I had taken that summer of the garden in full leaf. Beside it was a tiny wooden box that held three things: A piece of the cabinet trim I found in the garage. The first key Ryan had to his apartment. A slip of paper where I had written the words from that old night in Seattle, when I stood under snow and finally believed them. The best revenge is peace. I turned off the lights and went to my room and sat at the edge of the bed with my hands resting on my knees. The night felt full and simple. I thought of the people who might hear this story and feel themselves in it. Who might be sitting in a quiet room, holding a breath that has waited too long to be released. I wanted to tell them that bravery can sound like a credit card number typed into a flight at midnight. That boundaries can look like a folder labeled recipes tucked on a high shelf. That starting over can happen in the same house, with the same walls and the same address. Because the beginning is not a place. It is a sentence you are finally ready to say. Before sleep took me. I whispered one last thought into the dark. You are allowed to want a life that does not hurt. If you stayed with me to the end. Tell me where this found you and what part of your own voice you are ready to reclaim. Share your thoughts. Your favorite moment. Or a lesson that stirred something in you. If stories like this keep you company, stay close and add your voice so we can keep the light on for each other.